Welcome to Horrific Stories. Today's tale is a terrifying journey filled with suspense and chilling twists. If you love horror, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. The crisp mountain air was intoxicating as Mia, her boyfriend Ethan, and their adventurous friends Lila and Jack embarked on a weekend hiking trip deep into the Whispering Pines forest. The forest, known for its towering trees and tranquil trails, also bore a darker reputation. Rumors of people disappearing without a trace. As the group hiked deeper into the forest, the trail became increasingly overgrown. Their map, a dog-eared relic borrowed from a local ranger station, did little to reassure them. Lila joked about the cursed forest, but her laughter echoed uneasily among the dense pines. By sunset, they found a small clearing and set up camp. The trees around the clearing loomed unnaturally tall, their twisted branches resembling skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. A strange silence settled over the area, broken only by the occasional crack of twigs in the distance. "Probably just animals," Ethan said, his tone more uncertain than comforting. That night, as they sat around the fire telling ghost stories, Jack noticed something strange. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered. The others paused, listening. At first, it was faint, a distant rhythmic knocking sound, almost like someone chopping wood. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder and closer. "Could be a woodpecker," Lila suggested nervously, though her eyes darted toward the darkness. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward the forest. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice masking his apprehension. Mia insisted on going with him, so they ventured together toward the sound. They didn't return. Hours passed. Lila and Jack stayed by the campfire, their nerves fraying with each passing minute. The forest felt alive, the shadows between the trees shifting and pulsating. Then came the whispers, a chorus of disjointed voices murmuring just out of comprehension. The whispers seemed to circle them, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Suddenly, Mia stumbled into the clearing, her face pale and her clothes torn. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. "Run!" she gasped. "It's not Ethan anymore." Before they could process her words, Ethan emerged from the shadows. But something was off. His movements were stiff, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes, they glowed faintly in the dark. "Ethan?" Jack called out, his voice trembling. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he let out a guttural growl and lunged at them with inhuman speed. Jack grabbed a burning log from the fire and swung it wildly, managing to keep the thing that used to be Ethan at bay. "Get to the car!" Lila screamed, dragging Mia to her feet. They fled, with Jack bringing up the rear, clutching the makeshift torch. As they ran, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, blending into a cacophony of maddening laughter. The trees seemed to close in around them, their roots grasping at their ankles. When they finally reached the trailhead, the car was still there, but its windows were fogged from the inside. A faint handprint slid down the glass as they approached. They piled in, locking the doors behind them. Jack fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, but before they could drive away, something slammed into the back of the car. They glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Ethan, or whatever was pretending to be him, standing there, his mouth stretching into an impossible grin. They sped away, not daring to stop until they reached the nearest town. When they reported the incident to the authorities, the ranger simply shook his head. "You went too deep," he said grimly. "The forest doesn't let everyone leave." The next day, they returned with a search party, but there was no sign of the campsite or Ethan. The forest had reclaimed everything. Months later, on a quiet night, Mia swore she heard faint knocking at her bedroom window. When she peeked outside, all she saw was a tall shadow retreating into the woods. Every local in Ravenswood warned against venturing into Black Hollow Woods. The stories varied. Some spoke of ghostly figures, others of strange sounds and vanishing hikers. But to David, Sarah, and Liam, avid adventurers and skeptics, it was all just local folklore. Determined to prove the legends wrong, they set out on a weekend camping trip into the heart of the ominous forest. The trio started their hike early, weaving through gnarled trees and thick underbrush. The forest floor was unnervingly soft, as if it had been undisturbed for centuries. Shadows seemed to cling to the trees, and the air carried an unsettling stillness. As they ventured deeper, the trail markers grew sparse and then disappeared entirely. By dusk, they found a clearing surrounded by ancient oaks, their twisted branches forming an almost cage-like canopy. As they pitched their tent, Liam spotted a crudely carved symbol on one of the trees, a jagged circle with a line slashed through it. "Looks like some weird cult thing," he joked, snapping a picture. But Sarah frowned, feeling an inexplicable dread as she stared at the carving. That night, around the campfire, the mood grew heavy. The crackling flames barely illuminated the oppressive darkness around them. Without warning, the forest erupted in sounds, branches snapping, low growls, and what sounded like whispers in an unintelligible language. David grabbed a flashlight, scanning the tree line. "It's just animals," he muttered, though his hand trembled. Then came the smell. A sickening stench, like rotting meat, wafted through the clearing. It was overpowering, making them gag. Sarah grabbed her flashlight, pointing it toward the source. The beam fell on a grotesque figure crouching just beyond the firelight. Its skin was gray and mottled, its limbs unnaturally long, and its hollow eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger. Liam screamed as the creature lunged, impossibly fast. The group scattered, running blindly into the forest. The dense foliage tore at their clothes and skin, and the forest seemed to shift, disorienting them at every turn. Sarah found herself alone, her breath ragged and her flashlight flickering. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Thinking it was David or Liam, she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, she saw dozens of pale, eyeless figures watching her from the trees. Suddenly, David's voice rang out. "Sarah! Over here!" She sprinted toward the sound, relief flooding her, but when she reached him, she froze. David stood motionless, his back to her, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. "David!" she whispered, approaching cautiously. He turned slowly, his face contorted into a grotesque smile. His eyes were lifeless, his skin pale. In a voice that wasn't his, he rasped, "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah stumbled back, her scream piercing the night. Before she could run, the forest came alive. The pale figures emerged, surrounding her, their whispers growing into a deafening roar. When Sarah woke, she was lying in the clearing, the morning sun filtering through the trees. The campsite was gone. No tents, no fire, no sign of David or Liam. Only her. The authorities searched for weeks, but found no trace of the missing hikers. Sarah, now back in town, tried to piece together what had happened. She avoided Black Hollow Woods, haunted by nightmares of the figures and David's twisted smile. One evening, as she passed her living room mirror, she froze. In the reflection, standing behind her, was David, his lifeless eyes staring back. Nestled on the edge of a forgotten mountain range was Deadwood Trail, a remote hiking path steeped in mystery. Over the years, hikers had vanished without explanation, and the few who returned refused to speak of what they'd seen. Drawn by the allure of the unknown, Claire, her brother Sam, and their friend Nora decided to brave the trail for a weekend camping trip. The first day was uneventful, the trail winding through towering pines and moss-covered rocks. But as they ventured deeper, the scenery became increasingly eerie. The trees appeared scorched in places, their bark charred and brittle. Strange markings, deep claw-like gouges, marred the trunks. Maybe a bear? Sam suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they found a small clearing to set up camp. The air grew unnaturally cold, and the forest fell deathly silent. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. Instead, there was an oppressive stillness, as though the woods were holding its breath. After dinner, as they sat around the fire, Claire noticed something strange. The shadows cast by the flames seemed to move independently of their source, stretching and writhing like living things. She shook her head, blaming her tired eyes, but a low whisper interrupted her thoughts. "Did you hear that?" Nora asked, her voice trembling. "What?" Sam replied, his eyes scanning the darkness. "It said my name," Nora whispered. Her face was pale, and her hands gripped her knees tightly. Before anyone could respond, a loud snap echoed through the woods, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Sam grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the noise. The beam landed on a figure, tall and hunched, with unnaturally long limbs and eyes that gleamed like embers. It stood just beyond the firelight, watching. "Who's there?" Sam called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head in a jerky, unnatural motion, then retreated silently into the shadows. Panicked, the group retreated into their tent, zipping it shut and huddling together. The whispers returned, louder now, circling the tent like a sinister chant. Then came the scraping, a slow, deliberate sound of claws dragging across the nylon. "Stay quiet," Claire mouthed, her heart pounding. The scraping stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then, with a deafening roar, the tent collapsed as something massive slammed into it. The three screamed, scrambling out into the open. The fire had gone out, plunging the clearing into darkness. "Run!" Claire shouted. They sprinted blindly through the forest, the whispers morphing into a cacophony of guttural growls and mocking laughter. Sam tripped and fell, and when Claire turned to help him, she saw the creature, its elongated limbs spider-like, its mouth a gaping void filled with rows of jagged teeth. It reached for Sam, who screamed as its claws pierced his leg. Claire lunged, grabbing a branch and swinging it with all her strength. The creature hissed and recoiled, giving them just enough time to flee. They ran until their lungs burned, finally collapsing near an old wooden bridge. The creature hadn't followed, but the air still felt heavy with menace. "What was that thing?" Nora sobbed, clutching her knees. "I don't know," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "But we're not safe here." They crossed the bridge, hoping it would lead them to safety. But on the other side, they found something worse. A circle of trees adorned with human bones, their grotesque arrangements forming symbols that pulsed faintly in the moonlight. The whispers returned, now louder and closer. From the shadows emerged not one, but several creatures, their glowing eyes and gnashing teeth surrounding the group. "No," Claire breathed, backing against a tree. The last thing she heard was Sam's scream, cut off abruptly as darkness consumed them. Days later, Rangers found the trio's abandoned car at the trailhead. In the back seat was a note, scrawled in Claire's handwriting. "The shadows watch. Don't follow them." None of their bodies were ever found, but hikers occasionally report hearing faint whispers on Deadwood Trail, calling out names in the wind. Hollow Creek Woods wasn't a place locals visited willingly. Its dark reputation stretched back centuries, with stories of cursed land, vanishing campers, and ghostly figures that roamed the dense forest. Despite the warnings, college friends Emma, Ryan, and Chloe decided to test their courage with an overnight trip into the infamous woods. Armed with flashlights, a tent, and more bravado than sense, they began their trek just before dusk. The forest was eerily quiet, as though the trees themselves were holding a secret. Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but she kept it to herself. They reached a clearing by Hollow Creek, a narrow stream with water that shimmered black under the fading light. The group set up camp, lit a fire, and tried to shake off the unease. As the night deepened, the atmosphere grew heavy. The woods seemed darker than they should, the firelight swallowed by the shadows. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. "What's that?" Chloe whispered, her voice tight with fear. Ryan, the self-appointed skeptic, shrugged. "Wind in the trees," he said dismissively. But the tapping grew louder and closer, circling the camp. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam fell on a figure standing between the trees, a tall silhouette with impossibly long arms and a face that seemed to shift and blur like smoke. "Who's there?" Ryan called, his voice faltering. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one of its elongated arms and pointed toward the creek. Without a word, it dissolved into the darkness. Shaken, the group retreated into the tent, zipping it shut. Emma tried to steady her breathing, but the tapping returned, louder now and coming from all sides. The sound seemed to echo inside her skull, growing maddeningly relentless. Suddenly, Chloe gasped. "The creek," she said, her voice hollow. "What about it?" Emma asked, clutching her arm. "It's calling me," Chloe whispered, her eyes unfocused. Before anyone could stop her, she unzipped the tent and stepped into the darkness. "Chloe, wait!" Emma shouted, grabbing a flashlight and running after her. Ryan followed, his face pale. "This isn't funny." They found Chloe at the creek's edge, staring into the water. Her reflection didn't match her movements. It grinned as Chloe stood frozen. "Chloe, step away!" Emma yelled, grabbing her friend's arm. But Chloe didn't move. The reflection's grin widened unnaturally, and a hand, a pale, bony hand, reached out of the water, gripping Chloe's ankle. She screamed as it dragged her into the black depths. Emma and Ryan tried to pull her back, but it was too late. The creek stilled, leaving no trace of Chloe. Panicked, they ran back to the camp, but it was gone. Their tent, the fire, everything had vanished. The forest around them seemed to shift, the trees twisting and creaking as though alive. "What's happening?" Ryan gasped. Emma didn't answer. She was staring at the ground, where a trail of wet footprints led deeper into the woods. Against every instinct, they followed, desperate to find Chloe. The footprints ended at an ancient stone altar, overgrown with moss and surrounded by decaying totems. The air was icy cold, and a low hum vibrated through the clearing. Standing before the altar was Chloe, or something wearing her face. "Chloe?" Emma whispered. The thing turned, its head snapping at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You should have stayed away," it hissed, its voice layered with others, dozens of voices, all whispering in unison. Ryan backed away, trembling, but roots burst from the ground, wrapping around his legs and dragging him toward the altar. His screams were cut short as the earth swallowed him whole. Emma turned to run, but the forest closed in, the trees blocking every path. The whispers surrounded her, growing louder and louder until she couldn't think, couldn't breathe. A shadow loomed behind her, its elongated arms reaching out. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in the creek, smiling back at her. Weeks later, a search party found no sign of the trio. All that remained was a single notebook near the creek. Inside, written in Emma's handwriting, was a chilling warning. "The woods are alive. Don't follow the whispers. Don't look into the water." Locals say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the tapping and the faint sound of laughter echoing through Hollow Creek woods. Thanks for watching Horrific Stories. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more spine-tingling stories. Until next time, keep your lights on and your fears closed.